Thank you so much, Claire, for agreeing to speak to me about this truly stunning collection of poems. It's your third collection and it's called Yield. And as your readers will discover, that the word yield has three different definitions, and it's those definitions which give meaning to the odyssey you take us on in this collection, a journey which sees your son Liam become your daughter Lucy. I'd like to start with a question about this very particular journey. As a reader, I was really deeply affected by the strength of emotions in your poems, the pain, the joy, the confusion, and more than anything, the love. I know they're going to stay with me. It's a profoundly personal collection, and I wonder if you can say something of what it means to be a poet and to face something life-changing. You've written, as a poet, I see in poems. Can you say more about this?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for your really kind words about the book. I'm so pleased it had a resonance for you, because I know, you know, with your own experience and writing your own book, A Song Inside, following the sad loss of your son, it's really not easy to write about life-changing events. I mean, the words might come, you know, easily, but it's getting them in the right order and making sure they say the right thing for both yourself and your reader that's the challenge. So it's not, so I suppose in the short answer, it's not easy to write when it's so personal. But seeing in poems does help, because for me, poems are like little boxes that you can put a thought or an experience or a feeling in. And it's a kind of way of hoping to control the interior and exterior world that you're navigating. And also concentrating on the craft of the poem itself can sometimes help distract you from the weight of the inner landscape that you're traversing. So it's sort of a kind of a win-win in a difficult way. But also poems for me are vehicles to sort of say to somebody else, look, this is what I thought, what I felt, what I went through, but please read into it your own thoughts and feelings and experiences, and I hope it will help. So another way of navigating this, you know, this life-changing event is to share it in the hope that it might help somebody else. Also, I guess poems are a bit like diary entries. They on a personal level, they chronicle how you're feeling on a certain day. So they're useful markers when you're going through something. But poems can be quite slippery, and they sometimes turn out to be not the poem you thought you were going to write. Kate Clancy, who's a poet, recently wrote in Miss Lexia that you should be guided, I'm just reading it here, you should be guided by the poem you've written, not the one you set out to write. And that certainly happened to me in the first place. So I didn't think I was going to be able to write about this at all. It was sort of a topic that was, whoa, you know, don't touch it, it's too difficult, too hard. But then a poem came, and I started writing a poem that was sort of cloaked in some sort of anger and confusion. But as I wrote it, it became a poem of love. And then, bearing in mind what Kate said, I sort of hooked myself onto this poem and said, right, this is the place I want to reach at the end of this process. And so that is now the penultimate poem in the book. And it's the third definition of the word yield. But I didn't actually set out to write a book at all. It was, as I say, a collection of sort of poems that came sporadically and occasionally. And it was only when I sort of looked at them collectively, I thought, oh, with a bit of work, with a lot of work and a bit of luck, these might become a book. But it took 5 years. So it's not been a quick process.
No, I don't suppose it has. In this collection, you sometimes push at the boundaries of what's sort of usual or standard in the way you use language. I'm thinking of poems where you end with an unfinished sentence. What's true ends, the bones in its spine, small white discs of, and a full stop. And there are poems where you defy grammatical conventions. You, in storage, you say, and all the tiny of them. And there are poems too where you go beyond imagery into something almost fantastical. And for me as a reader, that really added to the power of the poems. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the choices you make as a poet, both as you're writing and then also when it comes actually to putting together a collection like this. Is there ever a conflict between your responsibility to your poet self and your responsibility, if you have one, to the reader?
Yes. There you go, there's the answer. It's always a challenge, and some advice I was given early on was to always be aware that you might need to take the poet out of the poem, because they can get in the way, and it's the poem that should do the talking. But having said that, you know, there's a balance to maintain, to create and then maintain between what you want to say, what the poem actually ends up saying. And as a novelist, I'm very aware of narrative, so I suppose I frame most of my poems in a sort of storyteller's voice. But also with poetry, there's a kind of need for it to travel vertically down the page in sort of speed and pace and travel, and also laterally in meaning. And at all times you have to be aware that you need to take your reader with you. So there's a compromise between sort of the art of it and the meaning of it. And also I'm very aware of how much the white space in a poem should work. You know, it does do a lot of heavy lifting, the spaces between stanzas, the space before the poem starts and after it ends, for example. And also I think over the years you get to know your own poet's voice and how that might resonate with a reader. So I'm very keen on concentrating on the concrete rather than abstract ideas, and letting the things of life speak to an issue rather than talking about in general terms. And Catherine Maris, who was my poetry school tutor, and who's kindly put a endorsement on the back of the book, and sort of gave me the advice that a poem should explore one central idea. So don't ask too much of it. Don't confuse it by loading it with lots of different sort of intentions. So what with the attention to concrete details, the things of life, the one idea, and then concentrating on the work that the line does. So do you enjam it, or do you use it as a unit, and how you stitch rhymes in and rhythms. All those sort of things collate to for the poem to become an experience. So having said all of that, there is also instinct. And there's that moment, Emily Dickinson said, if I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. And I obviously don't claim to be anywhere near her skill level, but I do get a fizz sometimes, just here in the back of my head, where I think, yeah, that's what I want to say and how I want to say it. So if I break the rules, so be it.
Thank you. I think you're right up there with Emily Dickinson, actually. Having read this really, really wonderful collection of poems. Now, one of the things that really struck me was that not only does each poem stand alone as a thing of beauty, because it's very, very beautiful, the writing, the way you've put these words together, but together they form an incredibly powerful narrative. You're telling a story, and there's a real dynamic to the story, and the reader, or certainly I was, sort of aware of the changes in you, and that's very beautifully captured in these three definitions of the verb to yield. And I wondered if you could tell us about the story that you're telling, and how the poetry came to form part of it.
Well, I can't quite remember when I had the idea to use the three definitions of the word yield. Because as I said, the poem sort of came randomly, and the penultimate one in the book actually came first. And it wasn't called yield then, it was called something else. But so I really can't remember. But once I did have the idea, I thought that it might help me by providing a frame for the narrative. And when I started talking to Rivers Press about it, they were very supportive of the idea. And without them and their encouragement and the dedication to producing beautiful, beautiful books, it would have been much harder to know how to control, you know, these poems and the story that I wanted to tell, because it's not something I'm telling in retrospect. The poems are the poems that I wrote at the time. But having said that, it's really hard to know what order to put them in. Because there are infinite choices. As you say, the poems should stand alone, and they should also join together to tell a compelling narrative. So with that in mind, you sort of have to think about how the poems might, have areas of discord in them, or they might chime with one another, they might reflect in a sort of mirror image of each other, or they might be very different. Luckily, I have a beginning, a middle and an end, because the three definitions of yield gave me that. Also, the poems in the book around the clinic visits, which we made to the clinic in London, were very much markers in the sand of the process that we were all going through at the time of the transition, and also the coming out poems. So those sort of gave me my skeleton, which was very handy. But as ever with poetry collections, it's there for the reader to make the connections themselves, and that's also part of what I want the book to do. I want anybody picking it up to read their own story rather than my story, in the poems as individuals and as a collection as a whole.
And I think they do. I certainly did. So this is obviously a deeply personal collection, and I'm wondering how it feels now actually to be putting it out into the world, and I wonder whether you can say something of your hopes for it, and perhaps something of your fears too, if you have them.
That's a really, really good question. And as I've said at the end of the answer to the last one, I don't claim that this is anything other than my story about my son becoming my daughter, who I've actually discovered as still the same person. It's actually, gender doesn't really make much of a difference, I have discovered. But everybody else, everybody else's story will be different, and that's why I want this book to go out there to hopefully help other people understand and put their own journeys into context if they can. I am concerned about responses I may get that I may find uncomfortable. Society has made a lot of headway, but there's still a lot of misunderstanding and intolerance around gender dysphoria, and the trans community are not always allowed the rights and respect and recognition that they should get. So I am aware of that. Having said that, as I've stressed before, I want this book to help others, so that I want to sort of show that it's okay to find it difficult. It's okay to make mistakes. I mean, at the beginning, I said all the wrong things. I used the wrong pronouns. I stumbled into sensitivities that I didn't understand. And we had some very bruising exchanges, Lucy and I. And there was one particular one, it was an email one, and she was saying some things and I was replying. And she'd been home for the weekend and it hadn't gone brilliantly, but I'd packed her a little hamper of food to take back to where she lives, and at the bottom of this email exchange it said, "P.S. the ham was delicious, by the way, Mum." And when she said that, I thought, okay, I think we're going to ride this out. Because what I came to realize was that as she transitioned, I had to transition too. From a mother of sons, 2 sons, to a mother of a son and a daughter. But actually, just as Lucy is the same person, I am the same mum. So really, a lot has changed, but not much has changed. And I don't want this book to be a manifesto. I just want it, like your own book, for Sam, to be a love story from a mother to her child.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your really, really thought-provoking answers to my questions. And I've no doubt that it will be remembered as a love story, and a very beautiful one. So Yield will be published by Two Rivers Press in February 2021, but it is already available for pre-order on their website. So to anyone watching, do buy it. I really can't recommend this wonderful collection of poems highly enough.
Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you.
Thank you.